Alright, good. The second aspect of what I wanted to talk to you about is if I'm telling you that, talent identification programs have some merit, but the real importance is in talent development, then why am I not telling you how we can improve that talent development? And the goal for this aspect of the session is that it marries up nicely with the practical session you'll be doing later on. So if I don't give you any answers now, hopefully Will and Reese will provide you with some of those or more questions later on. So where do we start? Well, I think most of you, is there anyone here who's followed some sort of course, motor control, motor learning, either university somewhere or some class or course or in coaching education? All right, so you might know this. This is called Snoddy's power law of practice. I've used the same archaic theories to try and demonstrate that most of what we do still stems from some of these ancient theories. Snoddy's power law of practice, 1928. If you go to a factory and you start rolling cigars, when you begin rolling cigars, you get incredibly good at it really, really fast. But as you keep rolling those cigars, your performance improvements start to slow down and slow down and slow down. That's the original study. The reason was, in the beginning you make many mistakes, and all those mistakes are really large. So each time you correct a mistake, you get a little bit better. But after a while, you stop making mistakes, so you stop improving. Snoddy's power law of practice still seeps through to everything we do now. We're looking at how many mistakes is someone making to try and understand how advanced are they within acquiring the skill. Right? That's still true. Right? We're looking at errors. That's right. The second theory we constantly use without knowing is fifth stage theory. When someone is beginning to learn a skill, that learning is highly cognitive. They have to think about everything. But as someone progresses through those stages of skill learning, behavior becomes more autonomous, more automatic. That's also a theory we all, whether we know that's a theory, but it's something we apply, right? In the beginning, you're trying to make a skill as simple as possible so they don't have to think about anything else. But as you go, you're asking them to, dribble with the ball and at the same time scan the opponents. Theory we use all the time. Last one we use all the time is called information processing theory. Basically, we're saying that the more often you get exposed to a very specific scenario, right, the better you get at dealing with that scenario. And you develop what's called a schema. That schema can also be translated as something called a memory representation. Right? You do something often enough, you store it somewhere in memory, and when you need it, you're accessing it, it comes back and, I know what to do in this case. I've seen it 100 times before, it was exactly the same, I know what to do. Right? So that's called information processing theory. Now, information processing theory still had some merit in the 80s, but we are long past that. Advances in skill acquisition have been so rapid in recent years that still thinking about these theories as the theories that help us understand how and why someone acquires a skill is outdated, so outdated. In fact, nowadays we use a completely different theory. It's called the constraint set approach. And don't be, don't look at all these words. I'll try and explain it in a much simpler manner. But what we basically say is that skill acquisition is an ongoing and dynamic process that involves the search for and the stabilization of specific functional movement solutions, and allows us or requires us to constantly adapt to a variety of constraints. Right, so what I'm basically telling you is that those theories that thought that they could describe the hugely complex process of skill learning, they're all too simplistic. I mean, and there's reason to think that because some of them were developed based on trying to roll a cigar, arguably not as important or as multifactorial or dynamic as skill acquisition in sport. Right, so this constraint set approach helps us to deal with that complexity a lot better. I'll try and explain it in a different way. Imagine this Australian freeway. Right? The Australian freeway demonstrates really specific coordinated behavior, just like you would see in someone who's executing a skill in a really skillful way. What I'm trying to say is, everyone who wants to pass a car tries to pass them on the right. We're not talking about those silly people who stay in the middle lane, yeah? But everyone who wants to pass a car passes on the right. On top of that, everyone sticks to predetermined rules. However, some people who are not as experienced, let's say P-platers, can only drive a certain amount, and they always drive on the left. What I'm trying to tell you here is that something that looks as incredibly complex, just like executing a skill is, or team performances, something that looks so complex can actually be described by how all of these different rules and constraints constantly interact. And because they interact, some really coordinated behavior emerges from it. Yeah? Sometimes that looks like a bit of an airy-fairy theory, but I'll try and show you that it's actually really applicable once you start thinking in that way. Plus, hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate to you that as practitioners, you're actually already using this theory as well. Yeah? So, in this session, we will investigate how the constraints that approach deals with, and these are the three most vital aspects we're looking at today: self-discovery and self-organization, using verbal instructions and demonstrations, and implicit learning. All right, so when I talk about self-discovery and self-organization, what I really mean is when all of these constraints or rules or environmental influences all come together, that results in particular behavior, right? When I'm talking about self-discovery, what I'm saying is that every single learner who engages in skilled behavior or in motor learning and skill acquisition takes into account a vast variety of all of these constraints and turns that into skillful behavior. Simplistic way of putting it, but I'll try and give you an example. Imagine this speed climber, or a regular climber, right? This regular climber will change his behavior based on the influence of different constraints. I'll give you an example. If this rock is wet, how is the behavior of the climber changing? Smaller steps, more careful, etc. There's a change in behavior. If that climber is flexible but not strong, how is his climbing changing? Yeah, so it might be smaller increments, or leaning more on the legs, or using that flexibility better rather than pulling himself up. Task constraints. If I'm asking that climber to climb to the top as quickly as possible rather than as carefully as possible, how is the climbing changing? Yeah, exactly. So by manipulating these constraints, we can change the behavior of that climber as much as we want. Now, what I'm trying to tell you is that when someone acquires this skill, what they are actually doing is they're learning to manage all of these constraints as much as possible, because they all interact, right? You can have to speed climb on a wet on a wet surface while you're not very strong, right? Constantly, these constraints interact, and because of their interaction, the learner self-discovers how to deal with those constraints in the most effective manner. That is basically what this theory says, and is much more encompassing than all of those old theories. Right. So let's take the example of a tennis serve, right? If I ask all of these kids to do a tennis serve, what are you going to observe? Different styles, right? The fact that there are different styles, what does that tell us? Where do those styles come from? Why does this kid have a different serving style than this one, and this one, and this one, and this one? Vastly different. Sorry?
The environment they come from. Like
yeah, that's right.
Playing at the backyard.
This girl might have a lot of experience. She might have brothers who always tennis, and she wants to play tennis as well. This kid might have never held a tennis racket before. This kid is incredibly strong, so he uses one of those power serves rather than something else. The other kid doesn't have really good hand-eye coordination, so only throws it up this high and hits it that way. When you ask someone to execute or learn a skill, that skill is the result of the interaction of all of these constraints. And once you understand how to control those constraints, you understand how to control the behavior. And that's an entirely different and new way of looking at skill acquisition than the old ways that we were thinking of before. So, when we talk about self-discovery, what we're really talking about is we're talking about the search for and the stabilization of specific functional movement problems. We're asking someone, what we want you to do is to serve the ball over the net. Now you do it. And there's a vastly different way in which all of these kids deal with the interacting constraints. Right? But it all results in the same task behavior. Eventually, everyone learns how to hit the ball. They just do it in vastly different ways. All right. However, what our constraint-led theory says is that if you interfere with this self-discovery process, you might as well not use a constraint-led approach. Because if you use prescriptive verbal feedback rather than encouraging self-discovery, what you're actually doing is you're limiting that learner's search for a functional movement pattern. Throw it up about a meter and then hit it with 1 foot forward. Right? Works for some kids, doesn't work for others. By doing that, you're limiting their ability to search for the most optimal coordination pattern. When you do a demonstration, and when I talk about demonstrations here, I'm talking about an expert demonstration. Right? I always talk about a coach that I used to have that said, this is how you take a free kick, puts the ball just outside the box and then just curls it in the top corner. Right? If you use a demonstration, what you're actually doing is you're trying to convey an optimal movement pattern to someone else. But does that optimal movement pattern actually exist for them? That's the question. Yep. So what we really want to do in the constraints-led approach is limit the amount of verbal instruction that we use and limit the amount of demonstration so we can encourage someone to search for an optimal solution rather than provide it. A good analogy is if I would have a maths equation on this board, pretty difficult, and my teacher would tell me, you're going to stand there until you solve it. While on this board, there's my friend, and he has a teacher who, after thinking a little bit, who just says, no, you figure out the first line's this, here's the answer. And gives them the answer for every single line. Who's going to learn the most?
You.
The one that gets the responses, or the one that gets to figure it out by themselves?
Well, maths is different to skill acquisition, though. In this
Maths
sense,
is different, but the
because there's specific, factual.
So you can't really compare the two because in that situation there's going to be only one solution, whereas here millions of solutions.
That's true. All right. Let's assume that it's not a really difficult equation, right? And there's maybe several ways or different steps that you could use. Let's assume that here I'll just answer my own question and maybe let's say this person learns the most because if you figured it out by yourself, not only have you received or have you gotten the optimal solution, but you've also developed the ability to adapt or how to get to that solution, right? However, we know that for many, many other things, and we educate our kids in that way, many of us, but we often don't do it within sport. So, for a demonstration, yeah.
Sorry, that's a little general because if you're learning to say play golf and you're doing driving, you do get a golf lesson from a really good professional. It's fantastic. It's amazing how you can enjoy the golf lesson. If you try and go to a golf course 18 holes and you haven't taken a driving hand before, it's a nightmare. So having that demonstration at the right level and on the sport you're playing, so you constantly build demonstrations.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's not what I'm saying. So I'm not saying don't ever do a demonstration again, don't ever use prescriptive verbal feedback again, but maybe look at it in a different way, right? So I'll try and hopefully show you as this session progresses that what we know traditionally and what we already use is actually not that different from what I'm showing here, but these theories actually underpin some of the practices we already use. For example, if this is a demonstration, what is the figure doing?
Walk.
Walking, all right. How about
Backwards.
how about this one?
Stretching.
This one?
Kissing his butt.
That one?
Handstand.
Yeah, a handstand or a headstand. How is it, or why is it, that we get that information from just a couple of dots? Right? They could be anything else, but why do we get that information? That is because when we observe a demonstration, what we see is relative motion. We sometimes underestimate how much information is captured within a demonstration. Right? When a learner watches a demonstration, regardless of it's an expert or a peer demonstration, they are always getting something from it. So providing a learner with the optimal movement technique, not with a solution to a movement problem, but the optimal technique to do something, is often irrelevant and not useful, because we know that our learners learn in such a vast variety of differences that allowing them only to execute a skill in one particular way is probably going to limit their ability to execute that skill over long periods of time. Right? So demonstrations should be used. Of course they should be used, they are vital, but they should be used to guide a learner's search to the most vital aspects of the movement, not to the idealized technique, but the most vital aspects. And in fact, there's lots of studies that indicate that using peer demonstration in many ways is actually a lot better, because not only does a peer demonstration convey a lot of the same information, whether that's a peer or an expert or a novice, we don't know, but it conveys the same information, but that information is also scaled down to the learner. If you're working with young learners, right, and my coach is kicking the ball into the top corner, I'm not learning a single thing from that. Because not only is it an idealized technique, and I can't do that because I don't possess the skill, but also it's an adult doing it, and I'm a 14-year-old kid. I can't scale that to my performance because I can't kick that far, right?
But is that peer demonstration happening already implicitly? Was that thing? Because
Yes.
it's not something that you say, okay, can you teach your
No,
colleague?
it's happening implicitly. So if you would have two kids doing that tennis serve, right? One of them was really skillful and the other was not. If you would have both of them sort of do a demonstration, they go back in a group and you ask them, all right, what is important about a tennis serve? Some of them will say, well, it's really important how you throw up the ball, because that one kid wasn't able to hit the ball and they were throwing it like super, super high and then waiting, you know how kids are, right? And then trying to hit it. Yeah? While the other one did it in a different way, but it actually worked. Right? So it is an implicit process. And that's what I'm trying to say. A demonstration should not be prescriptive. It should be an ability for your learners to learn implicitly. But we'll talk about implicit learning in a second. The second one is, why do I say, what is the evidence behind not to use these prescriptive verbal instructions? Well, don't look at this specifically, but basically, when you're executing a skill, there's different levels of control. Right? You can control things unconsciously, and you can control things really consciously. When you start to learn a skill, you're up there. You're doing things really consciously. But as you get better at it, actually you get better at using less and less attentional resource to execute a skill. However, when I then come over with my prescriptive verbal instructions and I'm saying, this is exactly how we're going to do it. No, you're holding your foot the wrong way. You're getting the ball where it should go, but it's not the right technique. Right? What you're actually doing is you're regressing your learners. They go from a more autonomous level all the way back to that conscious level, and they start thinking about every single aspect of the skill again. All right, so there's something in our terminology that's called hand-off practitioners or hands-off practitioners, and we're going to try and apply this concept when we go to the practical session. So what we're going to try and do is use prescriptive feedback sparingly. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it at all, but it means we're trying to apply a sort of extreme procedure to you now, so you end up somewhere in the middle afterwards. We're going to limit the provision of movement-related feedback. We're going to be creative in the use of demonstrations. We're going to talk with purpose, which is called a probing conversation. Many of you who coach already ask these sorts of questions. And you might ask, why did you achieve success in this particular skill? Kid says, oh, because I was throwing the ball exactly the right height. Great. Do you think throwing the ball at exactly the right height is important? Yeah, it's important. Oh, how does this kid do it? Oh, he does it differently. So why does it work for him? These are probing conversations. You're helping your learners to think in terms of how they acquired a particular skill. Then do not convey idealized techniques and manipulate constraints to have movement behavior self-organize. And then finally, and this is something we all struggle with, embrace the messiness. Messiness is a vital aspect of skill learning. And this is where Snoddy's power law of practice was correct. If there is no error, there is no learning. If you are not embracing the fact that there can be errors, it's very unlikely that your environment will be or will stimulate skill learning. Right, so we'll try and just look at a quick example so it makes it a little bit clearer once you go downstairs. So if you are a handoff practitioner who encourages self-discovery, we've already said how you could use demonstrations in this example. I'll skip that. How can you use verbal instructions? If you're trying to limit the amount of prescriptive verbal instruction you use, what kind of verbal instructions will you use?
Providing info on the outcome, on the desired outcome.
Very good, yeah, because after all, if the goal is to serve it, so it ends up in a specific area on the other side of the net, if it ends up in that area, but they've used a different technique, what does it really matter? If we embrace that skill acquisition is the search for an optimal solution, the search, right? It's a process. Then if you provide a good outcome, none of the rest matters. Yeah? And I'm trying to tell you that in a very extreme way, right? Remember, we always end up somewhere in the middle, but it's a way that we're going to try and apply it downstairs. Which movement-related feedback does this learner require? I mean, we've already answered that. Feedback on the outcome of the movement, not necessarily the process, but the outcome. And then which constraints can we manipulate to have specific behavior self-emerge? What can you do to get this person to serve in an appropriate manner so the ball lands in a specific area on the other side of a net? Which environment can you create for them?
Equipment, different equipment choice relative to their skill, age.
Yep, for example, this is something that's already demonstrated quite often, is if you have younger learners, they use smaller rackets, and let's say even bigger balls that are easier to hit, more likely to achieve the task goal, etc. So manipulating the constraints of a learning environment is really about thinking about the skill in a smarter way to try and think about how can I try to not be hands-on, but take a few steps backwards and let the environment or let the kid work it out in the environment that I created. And then finally, we've got implicit learning. So implicit learning is really learning that happens, and this is the sort of the holy grail of skill learning. Learning that happens in an incidental manner, often without real awareness, right? It's something that a learner can't really describe. I don't know why I learned the skill, it just happened, right? What we know about implicit learning is that things that are learned implicitly are really robust against external stressors. For example, someone taking a penalty kick in football, if you've learned that implicitly, you're much less likely to have outside influences affect how you're going to kick the ball or how successful you are going to be. And obviously that's highly related to discovery learning. One typical example of implicit learning is what's called analogy learning. If you're teaching someone how to do a breaststroke, right, you can make it really explicit and say, oh, your hands have to move exactly in this direction. No, you're doing it wrong. Look at the video. This is what you're doing. Or you can say, make a keyhole movement. If you say make a keyhole movement and this person swims for a while, eventually they are going to develop the most economical way of executing that movement. And that's what the constraints-led approach is about. It's not about creating absolute elite athletes just yet. It's about providing a developmental environment on which eventually we can build those foundations of elite performance. And then finally, external focus of attention. We know that if you focus attention externally rather than internally, you're helping your athletes learn as well. To give you an example, if I would focus attention internally when someone is juggling a ball, I would say, well, you've got to hold your foot in exactly that position, and curl up your toes a bit more. This is how you should be doing it. Or you can use an external focus of attention. And one study that was incredibly simple, but incredibly creative, used shoes of different colors rather than black shoes. And by providing shoes of different colors for young kids, these were 8-year-old football players, they actually started looking at their shoes rather than how they were moving their legs and how they were sort of touching the ball and whether they were curling up their toes a lot. So they moved from internal focus of attention to external focus of attention. And that's really important in the constraints-led approach, is to always focus externally. A good example of that is Johnny Wilkinson. In fact, in the beginning, before he played his first international test match, he was a horrible kicker. And he had a a very smart coach who helped him to focus externally, because he was saying, I'm overthinking this. I'm always thinking about how to execute the skill. That's typical. When a learner says, I'm overthinking this, what they mean is I'm focusing attention internally. I'm overthinking this. All right, so his coach said, imagine Dora. She's sitting in the stand, she's reading a newspaper. Kick the newspaper out of her hand. Johnny Wilkinson started focusing on an object that was 20 meters behind where he was actually kicking. He was really deliberately externalizing his focus of attention. And in his biography, he says that this really helped him to develop his, arguably extreme expertise in kicking a ball. Eventually, he started replacing Dora's newspaper with a can of Coke, etc. But he really used those analogies to externalize his learning. Then finally, before we go downstairs, I'd like to ask you the following. Imagine this exercise. 4 cones, 4, we'll call them attacking players, 2 defensive players. The task goal is the attackers have to keep the ball from being intercepted by the green players and throw the ball, roll it around, kick it, whatever they want to do, right? They can manipulate it any way they want. The defenders, or the green dots here, have to try and intercept the ball. Every time they intercept the ball, they get a point. Right. If we play this game, which behavior emerges? What do you think is going to happen to those 2 defenders? What are they going to do after a while, as long as they play it long enough?
Get the ball.
They're going to get the ball, but why are they going to get the ball?
So work together.
Because they're going to work together. They're going to communicate well, and likely what you'll see is, because they know that this pass is a bit more difficult than those 2, they'll position somewhere there, because it gives them the highest chance of intercepting that ball. All right, I'm taking you somewhere, trust me. What happens when we manipulate the following constraint? What happens when we pull this one and that one back? How is the behavior of our defenders going to change?
They're probably not going to run as much.
They might not
At
run
first
as much.
They might, but afterwards they'll stop running as much.
All right, and
And wait
what?
in one area.
Sorry?
And wait in one area.
Yes, that's right. So they're gonna, while they were here before, if you make that bigger, this pass becomes even more unlikely, right? After a while, it becomes quite a difficult pass to give. So they're gonna position themselves even wider. Automatically, by manipulating the position of one single cone, you are going to get that specific behavior. All right, let's continue. When we allow defenders to win points by also tagging attackers who are holding the ball, which behavior is gonna emerge?
Speed.
Pressing. And what about the attackers?
Evasion.
Yeah, they're going to rush it, right? They're going to throw it much quicker. That means they're going to have to position more, communicate more, etc. One constraint manipulation, completely different behavior. And then finally, when we force the defenders to hold hands, which behavior is going to emerge then? Teamwork. They're going to have to talk to each other, but they're never going to intercept the ball. And that's what I'm trying to talk about when I'm talking about a constraints-led approach. It is creating the environment by manipulating these constraints so a functional movement solution, a solution to a movement problem, can emerge only in one single way. Right? You control the environment, and would we all agree that I would never have to even talk to these defenders about pressing, teamwork, positioning? They would just do it automatically, implicitly, because I manipulated the constraints in the environment. All right. So I'll leave the conclusion for now because we ran out of time, but I'll send the slides to everyone. This is just a summary of what we looked at, but practical session. So when we go down to the practical session, is first of all, Reese and Will sitting in the back there are going to take you through a method of implicitly learning a digging skill in volleyball. You don't have to sort of run back and forth. It's just a matter of experiencing it. Right, we're going to use a really implicit method, and then after that, we're going to divide you into, it'll probably be 2 groups, and I deliberately chose this to be something that you haven't done before. You are going to provide the same approach to a 16-count dance routine and a dynamic balancing skill. And the dynamic balancing skill is a jump with a 360-degree rotation. That's all it is. They are completely abstract novice skills or novel skills, things that you might not have done before, but that provides us with the ideal platform to provide or to give you some of these hints into or first beginnings into using that constraints-led approach. So we're going to focus on self-discovery, how we use demonstration and verbal instructions, and something that I didn't finish, but I'm sure Will and Reese will finish it. So in terms of, I'll still be there and I'll probably be walking around if you want to ask some questions or just have a chat, I'll be there, that's fine. If not, this will be on the slides that I'm sending to you. If ever there is anything around skill acquisition or talent that you want to ask or need or something that you've read that's interesting, please contact me and we can continue from there. All right. Thank you, and I'll see you all downstairs where we'll probably have some more time for questions.